When we think about the Vietnam War, we typically picture young men in jungle fatigues carrying rifles through rice paddies, fighting an enemy they couldn't always see. We think of helicopter gunships, napalm strikes, and the chaos of combat. We think of a war fought by men. But this picture is incomplete. It erases the thousands of women who served in Vietnam, who faced danger and trauma, who saved lives and told stories, who contributed in ways that were essential to the American war effort, and who paid their own terrible prices for their service. This is the story of the women of Vietnam, the nurses who worked in hospitals and evacuation units, who held dying soldiers and fought desperately to save the savable, the journalists who reported from the front lines, who told the truth about what was happening even when that truth was uncomfortable, the women who served in combat support roles, who flew medevac helicopters, who worked in intelligence, who did dozens of jobs that put them in harm's way. These women served with courage and dedication. They witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And when they came home, they found that their service was often ignored or dismissed, that their trauma was not acknowledged, that their stories were not told. It's time to tell those stories. It's time to recognize the contribution of the women who served in Vietnam, and to understand what they experienced and sacrificed. Their stories are American stories. Their service is American history, and their voices deserve to be heard. The story of women in Vietnam begins with the nurses. Nursing has always been one of the few military roles open to women, dating back to the Civil War and earlier. By the time of the Vietnam War, the military nursing corps in all branches of service were well-established institutions with proud traditions. But nothing in their history had prepared military nurses for what they would face in Vietnam. Approximately 11,000 American military women served in Vietnam during the war. Of these, the vast majority, perhaps 80 to 90%, were nurses. They served in the Army Nurse Corps, the Navy Nurse Corps, and the Air Force Nurse Corps. They worked in hospitals, on hospital ships, in field evacuation units, and in air evacuation flights. Wherever American forces went in Vietnam, nurses went with them, providing medical care under conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. Most of the nurses who went to Vietnam were young, often barely out of nursing school. The average age was 23. Many had joined the military specifically to serve their country during wartime. Some came from military families and felt a sense of duty. Others were motivated by patriotism or adventure or a desire to use their skills where they were most needed. Few had any real understanding of what they were getting into. Nothing in their training or experience had prepared them for the reality of Vietnam. The nurses arrived in Vietnam expecting to practice nursing, to care for patients, to help the sick and wounded recover. What they found was something entirely different. They found themselves in a war zone where the wounded came in waves, where the injuries were catastrophic, where young men arrived missing limbs or burned beyond recognition, or with wounds that no amount of medical skill could repair. They found themselves working 18 or 20-hour shifts, covered in blood, making life and death decisions, watching soldiers die despite their best efforts. The nature of combat in Vietnam created a particularly terrible burden for the nurses. Because of helicopter evacuation, wounded soldiers reached medical facilities much faster than in previous wars. A soldier wounded in the field could be in a surgical unit within minutes or hours rather than days. This rapid evacuation saved thousands of lives. Soldiers who would have died from their wounds in World War II or Korea survived long enough to reach medical care. The survival rate for wounded soldiers in Vietnam was higher than in any previous American war. But this rapid evacuation also meant that nurses were treating soldiers with injuries more severe than any previous generation of military nurses had encountered. These weren't soldiers who had been stabilized over days of transport. These were soldiers who had just been wounded, sometimes minutes before, whose injuries were fresh and terrible. The nurses saw trauma that was almost incomprehensible. They saw what high-velocity bullets and shrapnel did to human bodies. They saw burns from napalm and white phosphorus. They saw the results of booby traps and landmines. They saw suffering on a scale that was almost unbearable. The operating rooms and emergency wards where these nurses worked were unlike anything they had experienced in training. In a civilian hospital, nurses might see one serious trauma case in a week or a month. In Vietnam, they might see dozens in a single shift. When casualties were heavy, after a major battle or a significant enemy attack, the wounded would arrive faster than the medical staff could handle them. The nurses would have to perform triage, deciding which soldiers had a chance of survival and which were too far gone. They would have to choose who to try to save and who to let die. These were decisions no 23-year-old should have to make, but the nurses made them over and over, shift after shift. The physical conditions in which they worked added to the difficulty. Most nurses in Vietnam worked in hospitals or medical facilities that were minimally equipped by American standards. Operating rooms were housed in plywood buildings or Quonset huts. Equipment was limited and often malfunctioned in the tropical heat and humidity. Supplies were sometimes scarce. During mass casualty events, the nurses might run out of blood, plasma, bandages, or medications. They had to improvise, to make do with what they had, to find creative solutions to medical problems that required resources they didn't have. The environment itself was dangerous. Hospitals and medical facilities were not immune from enemy attack. Rockets and mortars occasionally struck medical compounds, killing or wounding patients and staff. Nurses had to work while enemy fire fell around them, never knowing if the next round would hit their building. Some nurses were killed or wounded in these attacks. All of them lived with the constant awareness that they were not safe, that death could come at any moment. Beyond the physical danger and the overwhelming trauma caseload, the nurses faced enormous emotional and psychological burdens. They formed bonds with their patients, young soldiers often not much older than the nurses themselves. They would fight desperately to save a soldier's life, work for hours in surgery, do everything medically possible, and still watch him die. They would hold dying soldiers and listen to them cry for their mothers. They would write letters to families explaining how their sons or husbands or brothers had died. They carried the weight of all this death and suffering. One of the most difficult aspects of nursing in Vietnam was the youth of the patients. These were 18, 19, 20-year-old boys, many of them draftees who had never wanted to be in Vietnam in the first place. They came in with terrible wounds, terrified and in agony, calling out for help that the nurses couldn't always provide. Many nurses have spoken about how they came to see these young soldiers as brothers, sons, or boyfriends. The emotional connection was inevitable and made the losses even more painful. The nurses also had to deal with the psychological trauma of wounded soldiers. Physical wounds could be treated, but the psychological wounds were often beyond the nurse's ability to address. Soldiers came in with survivor's guilt, having watched friends die. They came in traumatized by what they had seen and done in combat. Some were angry or violent or withdrawn. Some refused treatment or tried to hurt themselves. The nurses had to manage these psychological crises while also treating physical injuries, often with no training in mental health care and no support from mental health professionals. Many of the nurses who served in Vietnam have described a particular type of case that haunted them more than any other: the young soldier who died calling for his mother. This happened over and over. Mortally wounded soldiers in their final moments would cry out for their mothers, begging for comfort that the nurses could not provide. The nurses would hold these dying boys, would try to comfort them, would sometimes lie and tell them their mothers were coming, anything to provide some comfort in those final terrible moments. These memories would stay with the nurses forever. Lieutenant Sharon Lane was one of those nurses who gave everything. She served at the 12th Evacuation Hospital in Chu Lai. In June 1969, the hospital came under rocket attack. Lieutenant Lane was on duty in her ward when a rocket struck the building. She was killed instantly, the only American military nurse to be killed by enemy fire in Vietnam. She was 25 years old. She had been in Vietnam less than a month. Her death shocked the nursing community and served as a stark reminder that women serving in Vietnam faced real danger. But death from enemy fire was relatively rare for nurses. The greater danger was psychological. The constant exposure to trauma, death, and suffering took an enormous toll on the mental health of the nurses. Many developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, they had flashbacks, they couldn't sleep, they self-medicated with alcohol or drugs. Some had emotional breakdowns while still in Vietnam. Others held it together until they got home and then fell apart. The military provided virtually no mental health support for the nurses serving in Vietnam. There was an assumption that nurses, as medical professionals, could handle whatever they saw. There was also the cultural expectation that women, especially military women, should be strong and uncomplaining. The nurses were not encouraged to talk about their feelings or to seek help for psychological problems. They were expected to do their jobs, to save lives, and to not complain about the emotional cost. Many nurses coped by shutting down emotionally. They learned to distance themselves from their patients, to see the wounded soldiers as cases rather than as human beings. This emotional numbing was a survival mechanism, a way to continue functioning in an impossible situation. But it came at a cost. The nurses lost touch with their own feelings and their own humanity. They became hardened and cynical, and this emotional numbing often persisted after they returned home, making it difficult for them to reconnect with normal life and normal emotions. The nurses in Vietnam worked under a system of one-year tours. They would serve in Vietnam for 12 months and then rotate back to the United States. This rotation system was supposed to be humane, giving soldiers and medical personnel a clear end date to their service in the combat zone. But for nurses, the rotation system created its own problems. Just as they were becoming experienced and learning how to cope with the demands of their work, their tour would end, and they would be sent home. They would be replaced by new nurses who had to start the learning process all over again. The transition home was often traumatic in its own way. Nurses would go from working in a combat hospital in Vietnam, surrounded by wounded and dying soldiers, to being back in the United States within a matter of days. There was no decompression period, no counseling, no gradual reintegration into normal life. One day they were in a war zone. The next day, they were back in America, expected to resume normal life as if nothing had happened. Many nurses found it impossible to adjust. Civilian nursing seemed trivial after what they had experienced. Working in a hospital emergency room in the United States couldn't compare to working in an evacuation hospital in Vietnam. The nurses felt disconnected from their civilian colleagues who couldn't understand what they had been through. They felt alienated from American society, which seemed oblivious to what was happening in Vietnam. They struggled with feelings of guilt about leaving Vietnam, about abandoning the soldiers who were still there, about surviving when so many had died. The nurses also came home to a country that was deeply divided about the Vietnam War. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the anti-war movement was in full force. Many Americans opposed the war and expressed hostility toward those who served. The nurses, like male veterans, sometimes faced harassment or contempt when they returned home. They were called baby killers. They were spit on or insulted. Some were advised to hide their military service, to not wear their uniforms in public, to not talk about having been in Vietnam. This hostile homecoming added to the psychological trauma the nurses were already carrying. They had served their country, had worked under terrible conditions to save lives, and they came home to be treated as villains or to have their service ignored entirely. Many nurses simply stopped talking about their Vietnam service. They tried to move on with their lives, to forget what they had experienced, to bury the trauma and pretend it had never happened. But trauma doesn't go away just because you don't talk about it. The nurses carried their Vietnam experiences with them, often for decades. Many struggled with relationships, unable to trust or to connect emotionally with others. Many had problems with substance abuse, using alcohol or drugs to numb the pain and the memories. Some had difficulty maintaining employment, unable to function consistently because of their psychological issues. Some ended up homeless or in psychiatric institutions. A number committed suicide, unable to live with the memories and the trauma. For many years, the experiences of women Vietnam veterans, particularly nurses, were essentially invisible. The public discourse about Vietnam veterans focused almost exclusively on men. The assumption was that Vietnam was a male experience, that women hadn't really been there or hadn't really experienced combat trauma. When people thought about Vietnam veterans struggling with PTSD or having difficulty readjusting to civilian life, they thought about male combat soldiers, not about female nurses. This invisibility was deeply damaging to the women who had served. They felt that their service was not recognized or valued. They felt that their trauma was not legitimate because they hadn't been in direct combat, even though they had been exposed to trauma that was in many ways worse than what infantry soldiers experienced. At least soldiers could fight back. The nurses could only watch and try to save lives, and often fail. The sense of helplessness, of not being able to do enough to save everyone, was its own form of trauma. It wasn't until the 1980s that the experiences of women Vietnam veterans began to receive wider attention. Books and documentaries started to tell their stories. Organizations were formed to support women veterans. The Vietnam Women's Memorial was proposed and eventually built in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1993. The memorial depicts three women, one caring for a wounded soldier, honoring the service and sacrifice of the women who served in Vietnam. As their stories became more widely known, a more complex picture of the Vietnam War emerged. It became clear that this was not just a war fought by men, but a war that involved women in significant ways. The nurses in particular had been on the front lines of the war in their own way, dealing with the consequences of combat, even if they weren't engaged in combat themselves. Their stories added depth and nuance to our understanding of the war and its human costs. Many of the nurses who served in Vietnam have spent decades processing their experiences and trying to find meaning in what they went through. Some have become advocates for veterans' issues or for improved care for those with PTSD. Some have worked to ensure that the service of women, veterans, is recognized and honored. Some have written memoirs or given interviews, determined to tell their stories so that future generations will understand what they experienced and sacrificed. One nurse who became a powerful voice for women veterans was Linda Van Devanter. Van Devanter served as an Army nurse in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970. After returning home, she struggled for years with PTSD, substance abuse, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Eventually, she wrote a memoir called Home Before Morning that became one of the most important accounts of a woman's experience in Vietnam. Van Devanter became an activist, fighting for recognition of women veterans and for better treatment of those suffering from PTSD. She was instrumental in the creation of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. She died in 2002, but her legacy continues in the greater awareness of women veterans' experiences. Another nurse who has shared her story is Diane Carlson Evans. Evans served as an Army nurse in Vietnam and later became the founder and driving force behind the Vietnam Women's Memorial Project. She spent years lobbying for the memorial, facing resistance from those who didn't believe women's service in Vietnam deserved its own recognition. Her persistence paid off when the memorial was finally dedicated in 1993. Evans has continued to advocate for women veterans and to ensure their stories are told and remembered. The Navy nurses who served on hospital ships off the coast of Vietnam had somewhat different experiences from those who served in land-based hospitals, but they too witnessed terrible suffering and trauma. Hospital ships like the USS Repose and USS Sanctuary provided sophisticated medical care in a relatively safe environment. They could perform complex surgeries and provide longer-term care than was possible in field hospitals. But they still treated the most severely wounded soldiers, and the nurses still had to confront the reality of war's terrible cost. The Air Force nurses who flew on medical evacuation flights had perhaps the most unique nursing experience in Vietnam. These flights picked up wounded soldiers from field hospitals and flew them to better equipped facilities in Japan or even back to the United States. The nurses had to provide medical care in the air, in unpressurized cargo planes, often with minimal equipment. They had to monitor dozens of patients simultaneously, some critically wounded, during flights that could last many hours. It was nursing under extraordinarily difficult conditions, requiring quick thinking and the ability to make life or death decisions without supervision or support. Regardless of which service they were in or where they served, all of the nurses who went to Vietnam shared certain experiences. They all witnessed trauma and death on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. They all worked under difficult and often dangerous conditions. They all formed bonds with their patients and suffered when those patients died. They all came home changed, carrying trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And they all, for many years, had their service overlooked or dismissed. The legacy of the nurses who served in Vietnam is complex. On one hand, they demonstrated that women could serve effectively in war zones, could handle the trauma and stress of wartime medical care, could make crucial contributions to military operations. Their service helped pave the way for the much broader roles that women play in today's military. On the other hand, their experiences revealed the terrible cost of war, not just for those who fight, but for those who try to heal. The nurses' stories are testament to both human courage and human suffering. As we look back more than half a century after the height of the Vietnam War, we can see the nurses' service from a longer perspective. We can recognize that What they did was extraordinary, that the conditions under which they worked were almost impossible, that the trauma they witnessed and carried was profound. We can understand that their stories are an essential part of the full history of the Vietnam War, that any telling of that history that leaves out the nurses is incomplete. And we can honor their service and sacrifice, finally giving them the recognition that was denied them for so many years. While military nurses were saving lives in hospitals and evacuation units throughout Vietnam, another group of women was serving in a very different but equally important capacity. These were the journalists, the reporters and photographers and television correspondents who came to Vietnam to tell the story of the war. They faced their own dangers and challenges, and their work would profoundly shape how the American public understood the Vietnam War. Women journalists in Vietnam occupied an unusual position. Journalism, unlike the military, had long been open to women, though women journalists often faced discrimination and were typically relegated to covering domestic issues or human interest stories. Vietnam offered an opportunity for women journalists to prove they could cover hard news, to report from war zones, to do the same work as their male colleagues. But it also meant confronting military and social attitudes that questioned whether women belonged in combat zones. The number of women journalists who covered the Vietnam War was relatively small, perhaps a few dozen over the course of the entire conflict. But their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. Several became among the most respected and influential war correspondents of their generation. Their reporting helped shape public opinion about the war and challenged the official narratives being promoted by the military and the government. One of the first and most prominent women journalists to cover Vietnam was Declassified. Chappelle was already a veteran war correspondent when she arrived in Vietnam in the early 1960s. She had covered World War II, the Hungarian Revolution, and other conflicts. She was known for her courage and her willingness to go wherever the story was, regardless of danger. Chappelle embedded with military units, went on combat patrols, and lived in the field with American and South Vietnamese troops. Chappelle's reporting from Vietnam in the early years of American involvement helped bring the conflict to the attention of the American public. Her photographs and articles showed what the war looked like on the ground, the reality of counterinsurgency operations, the conditions under which American advisors and Vietnamese troops were operating. She was committed to showing the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable or contradicted official optimism about how the war was going. In November 1965, Declassified was on patrol with a Marine unit near Chu Lai when a landmine exploded. Shrapnel from the explosion severed her carotid artery. She died within minutes, despite the efforts of a Marine corpsman to save her. She was 47 years old. Declassified became the first American female journalist to be killed covering combat. Her death was a stark reminder of the dangers that journalists, male and female, faced in Vietnam. But Chappelle's death did not deter other women journalists from coming to Vietnam. If anything, it reinforced the determination of women reporters to prove they could do this work. Throughout the rest of the 1960s and into the early 70s, a small but significant number of women journalists arrived in Vietnam to cover the war. One of the most prominent was Gloria Emerson of the New York Times. Emerson arrived in Vietnam in 1970 and stayed until 1972, covering the final years of major American involvement. She was in her early 40s, older than many of the soldiers she was reporting on, and she brought a perspective shaped by experience and a willingness to challenge official narratives. Emerson was known for her sharp questions and her refusal to accept military spin or propaganda. Gloria Emerson's reporting from Vietnam was notable for its focus on the Vietnamese people and the impact the war was having on Vietnamese society. While many journalists focused primarily on American military operations, Emerson insisted on telling the stories of Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire. She reported on refugees, on villages destroyed by the fighting, on the corruption of the South Vietnamese government, on the ways the war was tearing Vietnamese society apart. Her reporting humanized the Vietnamese people for American readers and challenged the tendency to see them simply as the backdrop for an American story. Emerson also reported extensively on the American soldiers fighting the war, but her reporting was not always flattering. She documented drug use among troops, declining morale, racial tensions, and the growing opposition to the war among the soldiers themselves. She reported on atrocities and on the dehumanizing effects of the war on those who fought it. Her reporting contributed to the growing sense among the American public that the war was not only unwinnable, but also morally corrupting. Another significant woman journalist in Vietnam was Kate Webb, who worked for United Press International. Webb was one of the few women journalists who was actually captured by communist forces. In April 1971, Webb was traveling with a group of other journalists in Cambodia when they were seized by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. She spent 23 days in captivity, enduring harsh conditions, and never knowing if she would be executed or released. Webb's experience as a prisoner gave her a unique perspective on the enemy forces that most Western journalists never gained. She observed her captors, noted their discipline and dedication, and came to understand that these were not the mindless fanatics portrayed by American propaganda, but rather committed fighters with their own motivations and beliefs. When she was finally released, her reporting on her captivity provided rare insights into the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Kate Webb continued covering conflicts in Southeast Asia for years after the fall of Saigon, becoming one of the most respected war correspondents of her generation. She was known for her courage, her integrity, and her commitment to telling the truth, regardless of whose narrative it contradicted. She covered wars in Cambodia, Lebanon, and elsewhere, always going to the front lines, always seeking the real story behind the official versions. Frances Fitzgerald took a different approach to covering Vietnam. Rather than focusing on day-to-day combat reporting, Fitzgerald spent years researching and writing an in-depth analysis of Vietnamese history, culture, and the impact of American involvement. Her book, Fire in the Lake, published in 1972, became one of the most influential accounts of the Vietnam War. It won the Pulitzer Prize and helped Americans understand the deeper context of the conflict, the cultural misunderstandings that had plagued American policy, and why the war had gone so badly. Fitzgerald's work demonstrated that covering Vietnam required more than just reporting on battles and body counts. It required understanding Vietnamese history and culture, understanding the political and social dynamics at play, understanding how the war looked from Vietnamese perspectives. Her book influenced not just public opinion, but also how historians and analysts would come to understand the war in the decades that followed. Television journalists also played crucial roles in covering Vietnam, and women were among them. One of the most notable was Elizabeth Pond, who reported for the Christian Science Monitor and later worked in television. Another was Beverly Deep, who worked for several publications and became known for her detailed knowledge of Vietnamese politics and society. These women and others brought the war into American living rooms, making it impossible for the public to ignore what was happening. The women journalists in Vietnam faced challenges that their male colleagues did not. They had to constantly prove themselves, to demonstrate that they were serious journalists and not just thrill seekers or dilettantes. They faced condescension and sexism from military officers and male journalists who questioned whether women belonged in war zones. They had to work harder to get the same access, the same interviews, the same opportunities to go on combat operations. There were practical challenges as well. Military units were not set up to accommodate women. There were no separate facilities, no privacy. Going on patrol or staying with combat units meant living in close quarters with men, sharing foxholes and bunkers, dealing with the lack of basic amenities. Some military commanders refused to allow women journalists to accompany their units, citing concerns about propriety or about the distraction of having women present. But the women journalists persisted. They adapted to the conditions, earned the respect of the soldiers they covered, and produced reporting that was as good as or better than what their male colleagues were producing. They proved that gender was irrelevant to the ability to be a good war correspondent. What mattered was courage, integrity, curiosity, and the commitment to telling the truth. The reporting done by women journalists in Vietnam was important not just for its quality, but for the perspectives it brought. Women journalists were more likely to focus on the human costs of the war, on the impact on civilians, on the personal stories of soldiers and refugees. They were less likely to simply repeat official narratives or to focus exclusively on military tactics and strategy. Their reporting added depth and humanity to coverage of the war. Women journalists also faced some of the same psychological challenges as the nurses. They witnessed terrible suffering and violence. They saw bodies and destruction. They interviewed people who had lost everything. They were sometimes in direct danger, caught in firefights or rocket attacks. Several women journalists were wounded in Vietnam. As mentioned, at least one was killed and another was taken prisoner. The trauma of covering war was real and lasting. Like the nurses, many women journalists struggled after leaving Vietnam. They had difficulty readjusting to normal life, to covering mundane stories after having covered war. Some dealt with PTSD, though it was rarely diagnosed or treated. Some had difficulty maintaining relationships. The intensity of the Vietnam experience had changed them, and they found it hard to connect with people who hadn't been through similar experiences. But many of the women journalists who covered Vietnam went on to distinguished careers, continuing to report from war zones and conflict areas around the world. They had proven themselves in one of the most difficult and dangerous assignments in journalism, and they brought that experience and credibility to their subsequent work. They became mentors to younger women journalists, helping open doors that had been closed to previous generations. The legacy of women journalists in Vietnam is significant. They demonstrated that women could cover war as effectively as men. They brought important perspectives to coverage of the conflict that might have been missed otherwise. They told stories that needed to be told, stories of suffering and courage, of moral complexity and human cost. Their work contributed to the American public's understanding of the war and to the historical record. Looking back at the women journalists who covered Vietnam, we can see how their work fits into the broader history of women in journalism and of women in war zones. They were part of a larger movement toward gender equality in journalism and in society generally. They opened doors for the many women war correspondents who would follow in later decades, covering conflicts from the Gulf War to Afghanistan to Syria. Today, women war correspondents are common and respected, but that wasn't always the case. The women who covered Vietnam helped make it possible. While nurses and journalists were the most visible women serving in Vietnam, they were not the only ones. Hundreds of other American women served in various military and civilian roles that supported the war effort. These women worked in intelligence, logistics, communications, administration, and other support functions. Some served as Red Cross workers, providing recreation and morale support for troops. Others worked for civilian agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development. Their service was often in the shadows, less visible than that of nurses or journalists, but no less important. The official position of the U.S. military during the Vietnam War was that women could not serve in combat roles. This restriction was based on laws and regulations that barred women from direct combat positions. In practice, however, the line between combat and non-combat in Vietnam was often blurry. The nature of guerrilla warfare meant that there were no clear front lines. Attacks could come anywhere. Bases and installations that were supposedly in safe rear areas could be struck by rockets or mortars or ground attacks. Women serving in support roles found themselves in danger just as surely as men in combat units. Women served in the Women's Army Corps, known as WACs, in various administrative and support positions. They worked as clerks, typists, personnel specialists, and in other administrative roles that were essential to keeping the military machine functioning. While this work might sound mundane, it was crucial. Modern military operations require enormous amounts of paperwork, record keeping, and administration. The WACs who performed these functions were doing work that directly supported combat operations. Some of the women in administrative roles had access to classified information and worked in sensitive positions. They processed intelligence reports, maintained personnel records, handled communications. They had to have security clearances and were trusted with information that could have endangered lives if compromised. The work required discretion, attention to detail, and an understanding of its importance, even if it wasn't glamorous. Women also served in intelligence roles, though in smaller numbers. Some worked as photo interpreters, analyzing aerial reconnaissance photographs to identify enemy positions, facilities, and movements. This was painstaking work that required extensive training and sharp eyes. The intelligence gathered through photo interpretation was crucial to planning military operations and understanding enemy capabilities. Other women worked in signals intelligence, intercepting and analyzing enemy communications. They might listen to radio traffic, work on code breaking, or analyze patterns in enemy communications. This work was highly classified and often tedious, but it could provide crucial intelligence about enemy intentions and activities. The women who did this work were part of the broader, intelligence effort that sought to give American forces an advantage over their enemies. The Red Cross deployed several hundred women to Vietnam as recreation workers, known as donut dollies. This nickname came from World War II, when Red Cross women served donuts to troops. But in Vietnam, their role was broader. They organized recreational activities, provided a friendly face and conversation for soldiers, traveled to remote fire base and base camps to boost morale. The donut dollies brought a touch of home to soldiers who were far from family and facing daily stress and danger. The donut dollies faced their own challenges and dangers. They traveled throughout Vietnam, sometimes to very remote and dangerous locations, to reach soldiers who were stationed far from major bases. They flew in helicopters, rode in convoys, and sometimes found themselves in situations where enemy attack was possible or even likely. Several donut dollies were present during rocket or mortar attacks on bases. At least one was wounded. They shared the dangers of Vietnam, even though they were civilians. The work of the donut dollies was psychologically demanding as well. They talked with soldiers who were dealing with trauma, fear, and grief. They had to maintain upbeat attitudes and positive moods even when they were exhausted or scared themselves. They provided emotional support to men who desperately needed someone to talk to, someone who reminded them of home and normal life. This emotional labor was exhausting and took its toll. Women also served with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in various civilian reconstruction and development programs. Some worked in education, helping to establish or support schools in Vietnam. Others worked in healthcare, agricultural development, or other programs designed to win hearts and minds by improving conditions for Vietnamese civilians. These programs were part of the broader counterinsurgency strategy, attempting to undermine support for the Viet Cong by addressing the needs of the rural population. The women who worked in these civilian programs often operated in very dangerous conditions. They worked in rural areas where government control was tenuous at best. They were potential targets for Viet Cong attack or assassination. Several civilian workers, including women, were killed or captured during the war. The programs they worked on were often hampered by corruption, by military operations that undermined civilian trust, and by the simple reality that winning hearts and minds through development programs was enormously difficult in the midst of a brutal war. Some women served in military intelligence units, including the Army Security Agency, which handled signals intelligence. These women had high-level security clearances and worked in facilities where they intercepted and analyzed enemy communications. Their work was critical to understanding enemy intentions and activities, but it was also highly classified. Many of the women who did this work could not talk about it for decades after the war due to the classified nature of their assignments. There were also women who served in air traffic control positions, guiding aircraft in and out of bases throughout Vietnam. This was demanding and stressful work, especially during periods of heavy combat when numerous aircraft might be operating in the same airspace, including medevac helicopters, fighter bombers, cargo planes, and other aircraft. Air traffic controllers had to keep track of all these aircraft, ensure safe separations, and guide them safely in conditions that might include bad weather, enemy fire, or other hazards. Women in the Air Force worked in a variety of support roles, both in Vietnam and at bases in Thailand and elsewhere in Southeast Asia that supported operations over Vietnam. They worked in intelligence, communications, administration, and other fields. Some worked at air bases that were subject to enemy attack. They had to deal with the stress of working in a combat zone while also performing demanding technical jobs that required focus and precision. A small number of American civilian women worked as flight attendants on contract airlines that flew soldiers to and from Vietnam. These women were on the Freedom Birds, the charter flights that carried troops to Vietnam at the start of their tours and carried them home at the end. They saw thousands of young men going to war and coming back from war. They witnessed the fear on the faces of those heading to Vietnam and the exhaustion and trauma on the faces of those coming home. The flight attendants on these charter flights played a unique role. They were often the last American women soldiers saw before arriving in Vietnam, and the first they saw when leaving. They represented home, normalcy, and the world outside the war. For many soldiers, the flight attendants were a connection to the life they had left behind and the life they hoped to return to. The flight attendants themselves were profoundly affected by this work. by seeing the impact of war on so many young men. Women also worked for voluntary organizations and religious groups that provided services in Vietnam. Catholic relief services, various Protestant mission organizations, and other groups sent women to Vietnam to work in orphanages, hospitals, refugee camps, and other settings. These women were motivated by religious faith or humanitarian impulses. They worked under difficult and often dangerous conditions to help Vietnamese civilians caught up in the war. Some of these civilian women were killed or captured. The dangers they faced were very real. Working in villages or refugee camps, they were vulnerable to Viet Cong attack. Several missionary women and aid workers were captured by communist forces and held for extended periods. Some were never heard from again and are presumed to have died in captivity. These women made conscious choices to place themselves in danger to help others, and some paid the ultimate price. The experiences of women in combat support roles were diverse, reflecting the variety of jobs they performed and locations where they served. What they shared was the experience of being in a war zone, of facing danger and stress, of doing demanding work under difficult conditions. They also shared the experience of having their service often overlooked or undervalued. Because they weren't nurses or combat soldiers, their contributions were frequently dismissed as less significant. This was particularly true for women in administrative roles. The WOCs and other women who worked in offices and administrative positions were sometimes denigrated as having cushy jobs, as not really having experienced the war. This characterization ignored the reality that even rear area positions in Vietnam could be dangerous, that administrative work was essential to military operations, and that living and working in a combat zone was stressful and difficult regardless of one's specific job. Women in combat support roles faced many of the same challenges as nurses and other women who served in Vietnam. They had to prove themselves constantly, had to demonstrate that they could do their jobs effectively despite being women in a male-dominated military. They faced sexism and harassment. They dealt with the stress of being in a war zone, the heat and humidity and discomfort of Vietnam, the isolation from family and friends back home. They also faced unique challenges. Unlike nurses, whose role was clearly essential and valued, women in support roles sometimes struggled to feel that their work mattered. They weren't saving lives directly. They weren't in combat. It was easy to question whether their contribution was significant. This could lead to feelings of inadequacy or guilt, especially when they saw the suffering of combat soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. After returning home, women who had served in combat support roles often found their service dismissed or ignored. If nurses and journalists struggled to have their Vietnam service recognized, women in support roles had it even harder. They were assumed to have had easy, safe jobs far from any real danger. Their psychological struggles were attributed to other causes, not to their Vietnam service. They had difficulty accessing veterans' benefits or support services because their service was not seen as having been genuinely challenging or traumatic. Yet many of these women did suffer from PTSD and other psychological effects of their Vietnam service. They had been in a war zone, had experienced rocket and mortar attacks, had lived with constant stress and fear. Some had witnessed violence and death. Some had formed relationships with soldiers who were later killed. The trauma was real, even if it was not acknowledged. Over time, as awareness grew of the diverse roles women had played in Vietnam, the experiences of women in combat support roles began to receive more recognition. Organizations for women veterans worked to include all women who had served, not just nurses. The Vietnam Women's Memorial specifically honors all women who served in Vietnam, regardless of their role. Books and documentaries have explored the diverse experiences of women in the war. One aspect of women's service in Vietnam that has only recently begun to receive attention is the sexual harassment and assault that many women experienced. In a military that was overwhelmingly male, with traditional attitudes about gender roles, and in an environment where normal social constraints were weakened, sexual harassment was common, and sexual assault not rare. Many women veterans have spoken about having to constantly fend off unwanted advances, about being propositioned or groped, about feeling unsafe not just from the enemy, but from fellow American service members. Some women were sexually assaulted during their service in Vietnam. For many years, these women remained silent about their experiences. feeling shame, or fearing they wouldn't be believed. The military did little to address sexual assault, often blaming victims or dismissing complaints. Women who reported assaults might face retaliation, or be told to simply accept that this was part of being a woman in the military. This created an environment where sexual violence could occur with impunity. The long-term psychological effects of sexual assault compounded the trauma that many women veterans were already carrying from their Vietnam service. They dealt not just with PTSD from combat-related experiences, but also with the trauma of sexual violence. For many, the betrayal by fellow service members was as traumatic as anything they experienced from the enemy. They had come to serve their country and instead had been victimized by those who were supposed to be their comrades. Only in recent decades has the military begun to take sexual assault seriously as an issue requiring institutional response. The experiences of women who served in Vietnam and spoke out about what they endured helped drive this change. Their willingness to break the silence, to share painful and humiliating experiences, has helped create an environment where sexual assault in the military is at least acknowledged as a problem, even if solutions remain incomplete. The legacy of women who served in combat support roles during the Vietnam War is complex. They demonstrated that women could serve effectively in a wide variety of military and civilian roles in a combat zone. They proved their competence, their courage, and their commitment. They contributed to the war effort in ways both large and small. But they also revealed the challenges women faced in a male-dominated military, the sexism and harassment they endured, and the ways their service was often devalued or ignored. Today, women serve in the U.S. military in virtually every role, including combat positions that were closed to them during the Vietnam era. This change came about gradually, over decades, as attitudes about women's capabilities evolved, and as institutional barriers were slowly broken down. The women who served in Vietnam, in all their various roles, were part of this long process of change. They demonstrated that women could serve effectively in war, that gender was not a barrier to competence or courage. As we consider the full scope of women's service in Vietnam, from nurses to journalists to those in combat support roles, several themes emerge. First, these women served with courage and dedication under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Whether treating wounded soldiers, reporting from the front lines, or performing the thousand unglamorous tasks that keep a military functioning, they did their jobs well and made significant contributions. Second, these women paid a price for their service. Many carried psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Some dealt with physical wounds. Many struggled with readjustment to civilian life. The war changed them profoundly, and not all the changes were positive. The costs of service were real and lasting. Third, these women's service was for many years unrecognized and undervalued. The default assumption that Vietnam was a male experience erased women's contributions and denied them the recognition and support they deserved. This invisibility added to the trauma many women veterans carried, making them feel that their service and sacrifice didn't matter. Fourth, the gradual recognition of women's service in Vietnam has been important not just for the veterans themselves, but for our collective understanding of the war. A full and honest accounting of the Vietnam War must include women's experiences. Their stories add depth, complexity, and humanity to the historical record. They remind us that war affects not just those in combat, but many others who serve in various ways. Finally, the experiences of women who served in Vietnam offer lessons that remain relevant today. They teach us about courage and sacrifice, about the costs of war, about the importance of recognizing all who served, regardless of gender or role. They remind us that when we send our military into harm's way, we send both men and women, and we incur obligations to all of them. The women who served in Vietnam, whether as nurses, journalists, or in combat support roles, deserve to have their stories told and their service honored. They were part of one of the most significant events in modern American history. They witnessed and participated in a war that shaped their generation and continues to influence American society and policy today. Their perspectives and experiences are part of the full truth about Vietnam, and that truth demands to be told. As the decades pass and fewer Vietnam veterans remain alive, the urgency of preserving these stories increases. The women who served are now in their 70s and 80s. Some have already passed away. Recording their experiences, ensuring their stories are preserved and told, is essential if future generations are to understand the full scope of the Vietnam War and the full cost of American involvement. The Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. stands as a physical reminder of women's service in that war. But more than monuments, we need living memory. We need books and documentaries and oral histories. We need educational programs that teach about all aspects of the war, including women's roles. We need to ensure that when we tell the story of Vietnam, we include the stories of the nurses who held dying soldiers, the journalists who reported the truth, and all the women in support roles who served their country in a time of war. These women served honorably. They faced danger with courage. They performed difficult and often heartbreaking work. They came home changed, often damaged, sometimes broken. They struggled to have their service recognized and their trauma acknowledged. They persevered, many of them becoming advocates for veterans and working to ensure that future generations of women who serve in the military receive better treatment and more support. The story of the women of Vietnam is not just a story about the past. It's a story that continues to resonate today as women serve in the military in unprecedented numbers and roles. It's a story about gender equality, about breaking barriers, about challenging assumptions about what women can and cannot do. It's a story about service and sacrifice, about the costs of war, about how military service can shape and change those who serve. Most importantly, it's a story about individual human beings who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and who responded with courage, compassion, and commitment. These were ordinary women from ordinary backgrounds who did extraordinary things. They saved lives, told truths, performed essential but unglamorous tasks. They were nurses and journalists and clerks and intelligence analysts and aid workers. They were Americans who served their country, and their stories deserve to be remembered, honored, and told. The medical innovations that came out of the Vietnam War were in many ways pioneered by the nurses who served there. The rapid helicopter evacuation system that saved so many lives required nurses who could provide sophisticated care in austere environments. The nurses developed new techniques for treating burns, for managing massive trauma, for preventing infection in tropical conditions. They learned to work with limited resources, to improvise when standard equipment wasn't available, to make life or death decisions in seconds. These innovations in battlefield medicine, developed largely through trial and error by nurses working under impossible conditions, have influenced civilian trauma care in profound ways. The modern trauma center, with its emphasis on rapid response and aggressive early intervention, owes much to lessons learned in Vietnam. The techniques for managing multiple casualties, for triaging patients effectively, for providing sophisticated care in less than ideal conditions, all were refined in Vietnam by nurses who had no choice but to figure out what worked. Many of the nurses who served in Vietnam brought their experience back to civilian nursing. They became trauma nurses, emergency room nurses, intensive care nurses. They taught the next generation of nurses, passing on not just technical skills, but also the ability to work under pressure, to make quick decisions, to maintain composure in chaos. The legacy of Vietnam nurses lives on in every trauma center and emergency department in America. But beyond the technical and medical legacy, the nurses left a human legacy. They demonstrated a level of compassion and dedication that was extraordinary. They treated every wounded soldier, whether American or enemy, with the same level of care. They held dying men and provided comfort when medical intervention could do no more. They wrote letters to families, attended memorial services, mourned the losses even as they prepared for the next wave of casualties. The emotional resilience required to do this work day after day, week after week, for an entire year, is hard to comprehend. The nurses couldn't allow themselves to break down, couldn't give in to despair or horror, because soldiers' lives depended on their ability to function. So they compartmentalized, they suppressed their emotions, they kept going. Only later, often years later, did the full weight of what they had experienced catch up with them. One nurse who served in Vietnam described it as living in two different realities simultaneously. On one level, you were a professional doing a job, focused on technical tasks, on medications and procedures and vital signs. On another level, you were witnessing horror beyond anything you could have imagined, seeing young men destroyed, feeling the weight of their suffering and death. You had to inhabit both realities at once and somehow maintain your sanity and your ability to function. The relationships that formed between nurses and the soldiers they treated were complex and often painful. The nurses knew that soldiers they saved would likely be sent back to combat, where they might be wounded again or killed. They knew that saving a soldier's life might mean condemning him to a lifetime of disability, of living without limbs or with terrible scars. These moral ambiguities were part of the daily reality of nursing in Vietnam. Some nurses formed romantic relationships with soldiers, or with the doctors and other personnel they worked with. These relationships provided comfort and connection in an environment of death and isolation, but they also brought complications and pain. When soldiers were killed, or when tours ended and people went their separate ways, the relationships ended, often abruptly and painfully. Many nurses and soldiers promised to stay in touch after Vietnam, but found that the connection that had been so intense in the war zone couldn't survive in the normal world. The racial dynamics in Vietnam added another layer of complexity to nurses' experiences. Black nurses, who made up a small but significant percentage of the nursing corps, faced discrimination and prejudice both from some of the soldiers they treated and from some of their fellow nurses. They served in a military that was officially integrated, but where racism was still very much present. Black soldiers sometimes requested black nurses, seeking someone who they felt would understand them better. Black nurses often felt caught between their identity as nurses and their identity as black women in a racist society. Hispanic, Asian American, and Native American nurses faced their own challenges related to identity and discrimination. For Asian American nurses, there was the additional complication of looking like the enemy in the eyes of some soldiers. They sometimes faced hostility or suspicion from wounded soldiers who, in their pain and confusion, couldn't distinguish between an Asian American nurse and a Vietnamese enemy. These nurses had to prove their loyalty and their American identity in ways that white nurses never did. The stories of minority nurses in Vietnam have been particularly neglected in historical accounts. Their experiences were shaped both by the general challenges all nurses faced and by the specific challenges related to race and ethnicity. Recovering and preserving these stories is especially important to ensure a full and accurate historical record of women's service in Vietnam. Religious faith played a significant role for many nurses in coping with the trauma of Vietnam. Some found comfort in prayer and in the belief that they were doing God's work by caring for the wounded. Military chaplains were important sources of support for some nurses. The presence of religious imagery and practices in Vietnamese culture also influenced some nurses, who found the Buddhist and Catholic traditions they encountered in Vietnam to be sources of spiritual reflection. But for other nurses, Vietnam destroyed whatever faith they had brought with them. They couldn't reconcile what they witnessed, the suffering of innocent young men, the randomness of who lived and who died, with any concept of a loving God. They came home questioning everything they had believed about justice, meaning, and divine providence. This spiritual crisis added to the psychological trauma many nurses carried. The physical environment of Vietnam added to the challenges nurses faced. The heat and humidity were oppressive, especially for those not accustomed to tropical climates. Nurses worked long shifts in buildings that were inadequately cooled, often in stifling heat. The humidity made everything difficult, from keeping wounds clean to maintaining equipment to simply staying comfortable enough to function. The nurses also had to deal with diseases and health threats beyond combat injuries. Malaria was a constant threat despite preventive medications. Fungal infections were common in the humid environment. Insects were everywhere, from mosquitoes to various biting and stinging creatures. Food safety was a concern, and many nurses experienced bouts of dysentery or other intestinal ailments. Simply maintaining one's own health while caring for seriously ill and injured patients was a challenge. Living conditions varied widely depending on where a nurse was stationed. Those at major hospitals like the one at Long Binh had relatively better facilities, with barracks that provided some privacy and comfort. Nurses at smaller evacuation hospitals or field hospitals had much more primitive conditions. They might live in tents or temporary structures, with minimal privacy and few amenities. Regardless of the specific conditions, all nurses were living far from home, in an alien environment, under constant stress. The social life available to nurses in Vietnam was limited and complicated. There were far more men than women, which meant nurses received constant attention, wanted and unwanted. Some nurses dated men they met in Vietnam, but the relationships were conducted under the shadow of war, with the constant awareness that death or separation could come at any moment. Social events like parties or gatherings at officers' clubs provided some relief from the stress of work, but they could never fully escape the reality of the war. Mail from home was crucial for maintaining morale. Letters from family and friends provided a connection to the world outside Vietnam, a reminder that normal life still existed somewhere. But mail could also be painful, bringing news of events and changes at home that nurses couldn't be part of. Some nurses received Dear John, letters from boyfriends or husbands who couldn't or wouldn't wait for them to return. Others learned of deaths of family members and couldn't go home for funerals. The mail was both a lifeline and a source of pain. The rotation system, with its one-year tour, created a strange temporal experience for nurses. Time was marked by how many days or months remained on the tour. Nurses counted down to their DAROs, their date of expected return from overseas. The calendar became an obsession, each day crossed off bringing them one day closer to going home. But as the end of the tour approached, many nurses experienced complicated feelings. They wanted to go home, but they also felt guilty about leaving, about abandoning the soldiers who would still be there after they left. Short-timer syndrome affected nurses as it did other personnel in Vietnam. As their tour wound down, they became more cautious, more aware of danger, more focused on survival. They had made it this far, and they desperately wanted to make it home alive. This was entirely understandable, but it could also create problems. Nurses who were short-timers might be less willing to take risks, might be more focused on their own safety than on their patients' needs. This created tension and guilt. The journey home from Vietnam was often surreal. Nurses would be in Vietnam one day, working in a combat hospital, and then within 48 hours, they would be back in the United States, expected to resume normal life. The transition was jarring. There was no decompression, no gradual reintegration. One day you're in a war zone. The next day you're walking through an American airport, surrounded by people going about their normal lives, completely disconnected from what you've just experienced. Many nurses have described the flight home as a time of intense mixed emotions, relief at having survived and being done with Vietnam, sadness at leaving friends and patients behind, anxiety about what came next, exhaustion from a year of incredibly demanding work. The flight gave them time to think, perhaps for the first time in months, about what they had been through and what it meant. But it wasn't enough time to process a year's worth of trauma. The homecoming experience varied widely. Some nurses returned to supportive families and communities that welcomed them home and tried to understand what they had been through. Others returned to families that didn't want to hear about Vietnam, that wanted them to just forget about it and move on. Some returned to communities where opposition to the war was strong and where anyone associated with the military was viewed with hostility. The cultural climate in America had changed dramatically during the year many nurses were in Vietnam. The country was increasingly divided over the war. The anti-war movement was growing. Young people, the same age as the soldiers dying in Vietnam, were protesting and sometimes rioting. The consensus that had supported American involvement in the war was breaking down. The nurses returned to a country that was fundamentally different from the one they had left. Readjusting to civilian nursing was difficult for many Vietnam nurse veterans. The pace seemed slow. The injuries and illnesses seemed trivial compared to what they had treated in Vietnam. Civilian nurses who hadn't been to war couldn't understand why Vietnam nurses seemed so intense, so impatient with normal hospital procedures and politics. Some Vietnam nurses left nursing altogether, unable to find meaning in civilian practice after the intensity of Vietnam. Others threw themselves into work, using it as a way to avoid dealing with their trauma. They worked long hours, took the most demanding assignments, stayed busy so they wouldn't have time to think or feel. This strategy worked for a while, but eventually many burned out. The unprocessed trauma would emerge in various ways: anger, depression, nightmares, flashbacks, substance abuse, relationship problems. The Vietnam nurse veterans who struggled the most were often those who had no support system and no outlet for their experiences, those who could talk to other Vietnam veterans, who could share their stories with people who understood, generally did better than those who felt they had to keep their experiences bottled up. But for many years, there were few opportunities for Vietnam nurse veterans to connect with each other or to access appropriate support services. The development of the Vietnam Veterans of America. Women's Project in the 1980s provided crucial support for women veterans. This project, which grew out of grassroots organizing by women veterans, created spaces where women could share their experiences and support each other. It advocated for recognition of women's service and for better access to veteran services. It helped break the isolation that many women veterans had experienced. Research on women Vietnam, veterans, particularly nurses, has revealed the extent of PTSD and other psychological injuries they carried. Studies found that many nurse veterans met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD decades after the war. They experienced intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, avoidance of reminders of Vietnam, emotional numbing. The symptoms were as severe as those experienced by male combat veterans, challenging assumptions that only direct combat exposure caused PTSD. This research was important not just for Vietnam nurse veterans, but for understanding PTSD more broadly. It demonstrated that witnessing trauma, even without being directly threatened, could cause lasting psychological injury. It showed that exposure to death and suffering, even in a caregiving role, could be profoundly traumatic. These findings influenced how PTSD was understood and diagnosed and helped expand access to treatment for those whose trauma came from witnessing, rather than directly experiencing violence. Treatment approaches for Vietnam nurse veterans have evolved over time. Early attempts to treat PTSD focused primarily on male combat veterans and didn't always address the specific experiences and needs of nurses. But specialized treatment programs developed that recognized the particular trauma of nursing in a war zone. These programs helped nurse veterans process their experiences, develop coping strategies, and integrate their Vietnam service into their life stories in healthier ways. Group therapy with other nurse veterans proved particularly effective. In these groups, women could share experiences that only another Vietnam nurse could truly understand. They could talk about the specific challenges of nursing in a combat zone, about the guilt and grief they carried, about the difficulty of the homecoming. They found validation and understanding that they often couldn't find elsewhere. These groups helped many nurse veterans finally come to terms with their Vietnam experience. The women journalists who covered Vietnam faced their own challenges in readjusting to post-Vietnam life. Some found that their Vietnam experience had changed them fundamentally, had given them a perspective that made it difficult to cover ordinary stories back home. The superficiality of much mainstream journalism seemed intolerable after having covered life and death issues in Vietnam. Some journalists left the profession altogether. Others sought out other conflict zones, becoming war correspondents who covered conflicts around the world. The journalists who continued covering wars after Vietnam carried their Vietnam experience with them. They had seen what war really looked like, had understood its costs and complexities. This experience informed their reporting on subsequent conflicts. They were less likely to romanticize war, less likely to uncritically repeat official narratives, more likely to focus on human costs and moral ambiguities. Their Vietnam experience made them better journalists, but also took a psychological toll. Like nurses, women journalists who covered Vietnam often struggled with PTSD and other psychological issues. They had witnessed violence and suffering. They had been in danger. Some had lost colleagues to the war. The trauma was real, even though they had not been combatants themselves. But as civilians, they had even less access to support services than military veterans. They were largely on their own in dealing with the psychological aftermath of their Vietnam experience. The women who served in combat support roles faced similar challenges in readjusting to civilian life. Their service was often not recognized as significant, so they felt they couldn't talk about their experiences or claim veteran status. They struggled to access veterans' benefits and services. Many felt isolated, believing no one would understand or care about what they had gone through. This isolation compounded the psychological effects of their service. Over the decades since the Vietnam War, many women veterans have found ways to give meaning to their experience through advocacy and service. Some have worked with veterans organizations, helping other women veterans access services and support. Some have become therapists or counselors specializing in trauma. Some have written books or given talks, sharing their stories to educate others. These activities have helped give purpose to suffering. have turned trauma into something that could benefit others. The Vietnam Women's Memorial, dedicated in 1993, was a watershed moment for women Vietnam veterans. For the first time, their service was being recognized with a national monument. The dedication ceremony brought together hundreds of women veterans, many of whom had never before connected with other women who served in Vietnam. The experience of being recognized, of having their service validated, was healing for many. The memorial itself, showing a nurse caring for a wounded soldier, captured the essential nature of women's service in Vietnam. But recognition through monuments and ceremonies, while important, could not undo the damage that had been done. The nurses who developed PTSD, who struggled with substance abuse, who had broken relationships and disrupted lives, could not be made whole by belated recognition. Recognition was necessary, but not sufficient. It needed to be accompanied by concrete support, access to health care, to mental health services, to disability compensation, to the full range of veterans' benefits. Ensuring that women Vietnam veterans received the benefits they had earned required advocacy and sometimes legal action. Women veterans had to fight for recognition that their service-connected disabilities were real, that their PTSD was related to their Vietnam service, that they deserved the same benefits as male veterans. Progress came slowly, and many women veterans died before receiving the recognition and support they deserved. Today, more than 50 years after the height of the Vietnam War, the women who served are in their 70s, 80s, and beyond. Many have died. Those who remain carry the full weight of their years and of their Vietnam experience. Some have found peace and have integrated their Vietnam service into their life stories in healthy ways. Others still struggle with trauma and grief. All have been shaped by their experience in ways both profound and permanent. The legacy these women leave is complex and multi-layered. They demonstrated women's capacity to serve in war, to perform demanding and dangerous work under extraordinarily difficult conditions. They showed courage and compassion. They saved lives, told truths, supported the war effort. They paid prices in trauma, in health, in relationships, in years of struggle and pain. They opened doors for future generations of women in the military and in war correspondence and in other roles that had previously been closed or limited. But their legacy also includes a warning. It includes the recognition that sending anyone, male or female, to war has profound human costs. It includes an understanding that those costs extend beyond physical injuries to psychological and spiritual wounds that can last a lifetime. It includes an awareness that we as a society have an obligation to those who serve, an obligation that extends far beyond the duration of their service to encompass their entire lives. As we tell the story of the women who served in Vietnam, we must tell it fully and honestly. We must acknowledge both the courage and the cost. We must recognize the significance of their service while also understanding the price they paid. We must honor their sacrifices while also learning from their experiences. And we must ensure that their stories are preserved and passed on, so that future generations understand what these women experienced and what they contributed. The women of Vietnam, the nurses and journalists, and all those who served in various roles deserve our gratitude, our recognition, and our support. They answered their country's call. They served with distinction. They came home changed and often damaged. They struggled to have their service recognized and their trauma acknowledged. They persevered. They survived. And they left a legacy that continues to shape how we understand war, gender, service, and sacrifice. Their stories are American stories. Their service is American history. And their voices, finally being heard after too many years of silence, tell truths we need to hear and remember.